Farming in the Middle Ages was a far cry from how we farm today. No tractors, no large machines, and no big warehouses storing crops for the winter. Instead, farmers had to rely on basic tools, hard work, and lots of teamwork to grow food. And here's the thing, they didn't have modern technology to help them out. There were no GPS systems or automated irrigation systems. No matter how difficult the conditions, medieval farmers needed to make do with what they had. So why is this important? Because despite all of these limitations, medieval farming practices managed to feed entire villages for centuries, which is quite an achievement. The farmers back then didn't just get by. They developed ways of growing more food, even with fewer tools and less land. But how did they manage it? The answer lies in their ability to be innovative and adapt to their surroundings. Let's take a moment to understand the challenges medieval farmers faced, which will give us a better idea of why their methods were so important. First off, the tools they had were not anything like the machinery we use today. Instead of big combines or automated harvesters, they had simple wooden plows, sickles, and hoes. These tools were effective, but they required a lot of physical labor. For example, wooden plows would struggle to break through the tough, clay-heavy soil found in many parts of Europe. Farmers had to work hard just to till a small patch of land. It wasn't a quick job by any means, and the output was often limited by the tools available. This lack of modern tools meant farmers had to get creative. They needed to find ways to grow enough food to feed their families and communities, despite having few resources to do so. Now, let's talk about another big challenge: the weather. Unlike today, where we have weather forecasts and irrigation systems, medieval farmers were at the mercy of nature. A single bad storm, a dry spell, or a frost could ruin an entire crop, leaving farmers with very little to harvest. And because there were no advanced techniques to manage weather issues, farmers had to prepare for all kinds of scenarios, often without knowing what was coming. Some years might see abundant crops, while others might result in a crop failure due to harsh conditions. But despite these risks, the ability to grow enough food was vital for survival. If crops failed, entire villages could starve. Farmers had to find ways to spread their risk, ensuring that even if one crop failed, another might still survive. In addition to the weather, medieval farmers had another challenge to deal with: pests and weeds. Imagine a field full of crops you've worked so hard to grow, only to have insects, rodents, and weeds destroy them. Today we have pesticides and herbicides to manage these problems, but back then farmers didn't have these tools. Instead, they had to rely on their knowledge of nature to help them manage pests and weeds. They had to figure out ways to control pests like aphids and caterpillars without using modern chemicals. Similarly, weeds like thistles and dandelions could easily invade the crops, stealing nutrients from the soil and crowding out the crops. Without the ability to use herbicides, they had to find different ways to stop the spread of weeds. Despite all of these challenges, poor tools, unpredictable weather, and pest, medieval farmers still found ways to grow more food with fewer resources. They didn't just rely on brute force. Instead, they got smarter. Over time, they developed a number of farming strategies that helped them make the most of the land they had. These innovations didn't come overnight. It took years of trial and error, learning from mistakes, and sharing knowledge between neighboring communities. The key was understanding the environment around them and making decisions that would help their crops thrive. Learned how to rotate crops, use natural pest control methods, and adapt to the weather in ways that kept their farms productive, even in tough times. While they didn't have modern tools, they had something just as important: creativity, patience, and the willingness to innovate. One of the smartest farming techniques medieval farmers used to increase their food production was crop rotation. This simple yet highly effective method allowed them to grow more food without exhausting the soil. Let's break down how crop rotation worked, why it was important, and how it helped farmers get more from their land while using less labor. Crop rotation involves changing the crops grown in a particular field from year to year. Instead of planting the same crop in the same place year after year, farmers would rotate different crops through the land. This wasn't just for variety, there was a very good reason behind it. Crops, like wheat or barley, take certain nutrients from the soil. If the same crop is planted over and over again, it can deplete the soil of those nutrients, leaving it less fertile. By rotating crops, farmers could give the soil a break, allowing it to replenish nutrients and stay healthy. Some crops, like beans and peas, are especially good for the soil because they add nitrogen back into it, a nutrient that other crops like wheat take away. So, rotating crops helped farmers maintain healthier soil, which meant more productive harvests. One of the most famous crop rotation systems developed during the Middle Ages was the three-field system. This method divided the land into three parts. In one part, farmers would plant grains like wheat or rye. In the second part, they would plant legumes like beans or peas, which help replenish the soil with nitrogen. The third part of the land would be left fallow or empty for a year. This fallow field allowed the soil to rest and recover. While 1/3 of the land was resting, the other 2/3 were still actively producing crops. The next year, the fields would be rotated. The wheat field would become the legume field. The legume field would become fallow, and the fallow field would now grow wheat. This system meant that farmers always had some fields producing crops while giving others a break to restore nutrients. The benefits of crop rotation were significant. By rotating crops, farmers could avoid soil exhaustion. Instead of planting the same crop year after year and depleting the soil, they rotated different crops that had different nutrient needs. This helped the soil stay healthy and productive for longer periods. Crop rotation also helped reduce pest problems. Many pests are attracted to specific crops. By changing what crops were planted, farmers made it harder for pests to settle in one place. If a pest liked eating beans, for example, it wouldn't find beans in the field the next year, as the crops would be rotated. This reduced the chance of pests building up in large numbers and damaging crops. Another benefit was that crop rotation reduced the risk of crop diseases. If the same crops were grown repeatedly in the same field, diseases would have a chance to build up in the soil. Rotating crops helped prevent the spread of disease, as the pathogens that affect one crop wouldn't have a chance to survive when a different crop was planted. In some parts of medieval Europe, farmers used a two-field system instead of the three-field system. This method was a bit simpler, but still effective. The land was divided into two parts, and one field would be planted while the other rested. After a year, the fields would switch. What was once planted would now be fallow, and what was fallow would be planted. The two-field system didn't provide as much resting time for the soil as the three-field system, but it still allowed farmers to manage their land more efficiently. It also meant that they could always have crops growing, even if they were only using half of the land each year. So why did crop rotation work so well for medieval farmers? It worked because it allowed them to make the most of the land without wearing it out. The soil is like a living organism. It needs time to rest and recover, and crop rotation gave it that time. With crop rotation, farmers could grow a variety of crops, each contributing something different to the soil. Legumes, for example, help add nitrogen back into the soil, which is essential for the growth of many plants. Other crops, like wheat, require nitrogen, so planting them after legumes helped balance the soil's nutrients. Crop rotation also helped keep pests and diseases in check. By changing what crops were grown, farmers confused pests and reduced the chances of them sticking around. It was like playing a game of hide and seek with the bugs. In the end, crop rotation made farming much more efficient. Instead of exhausting the soil by planting the same crop year after year, farmers could grow a variety of crops and ensure their land stayed productive for much longer. The benefits of crop rotation were indeed just about growing more food. They also had a huge impact on medieval society. By rotating crops, farmers were able to feed more people without exhausting the land. This increased food production meant that communities were more likely to survive tough times, like bad weather or crop failures. Additionally, by using crop rotation, medieval farmers didn't need to rely on artificial fertilizers, which weren't available at the time. They could grow healthy crops using natural methods that were sustainable over the long term. This made farming in the Middle Ages more resilient to the unpredictable challenges they faced, ensuring that even in years of poor harvests, they had enough food to keep going. Section 3. The moldboard plow, revolutionizing farming tools in the Middle Ages. One of the most important farming innovations that allowed farmers to grow more food with less effort was the development of the moldboard plow. Before this tool, medieval farmers struggled with inefficient plows that could barely break through the tough soil of Northern Europe. The introduction of the moldboard plow changed everything, making farming faster, more efficient, and ultimately allowing farmers to produce more food with fewer resources. Let's take a look at why the moldboard plow was such a game changer. Before the moldboard plow, the most common plows used by farmers were simple wooden tools. These plows were essentially just pointed sticks that could barely scratch the surface of the soil. In regions with lighter, sandier soil, these plows could do a decent job of turning the earth. But in northern Europe, where the soil was often dense and clay-rich, these primitive plows were almost useless. Farmers needed to break through heavy soil to plant crops. But these simple tools didn't have the power to do the job effectively. As a result, farmers would often have to use multiple oxen, sometimes up to 8 or 10, to pull the plows through the tough soil. And even then, the results were underwhelming. The soil wasn't properly turned, and farmers struggled to plant crops in the ground. This created a serious bottleneck in farming productivity. Without a proper plow, the amount of land that could be worked was severely limited. Around the 9th century, a breakthrough occurred in farming tools: the moldboard plow. This new plow was a complete game changer, and it revolutionized agriculture in medieval Europe. What made the moldboard plow so different was its design. The plow had 3 essential components that worked together to create a more effective tool for turning the soil. 1. The coulter. This was a vertical blade that sliced into the ground, cutting through the earth and creating a trench for the rest of the plow to follow. This made it easier to get started and ensured the plow would stay on course. 2. The plowshare. This horizontal blade would then cut beneath the soil, loosening it up and making it easier to turn over. It essentially worked like a shovel, digging deeper into the earth and breaking up compacted soil. 3. The moldboard. The real game changer was the moldboard, a curved wooden board attached to the plow. This part of the plow actually flipped the soil over, burying weeds and plant material that would eventually rot and decompose, adding nutrients to the soil. This made it much easier for farmers to prepare their fields for planting. The combination of these 3 parts allowed farmers to break through dense, tough soil much more easily and effectively than before. The moldboard plow could handle heavier soil, making it ideal for northern Europe's clay-rich terrain. The moldboard plow didn't just make plowing easier, it made farming much more efficient overall. Prior to the invention of the moldboard plow, farmers would spend long hours and hard labor just to prepare their fields for planting. The new plow was able to break through tough soil in half the time. Farmers no longer needed to use as many oxen, and they didn't have to work as long to get the fields ready for planting. This saved them valuable time and energy. Studies have shown that the new plow required fewer oxen to pull it. While older plows might need 6 to 8 oxen, the moldboard plow could do the same job with just 2 to 4 oxen. This was a huge saving in terms of animal care and food resources, as less land needed to be dedicated to growing food for the animals. This also allowed farmers to focus more on actual crop production, rather than tending to their animals. The moldboard plow wasn't without its challenges, though. It was more complex than the previous wooden plows, which meant it was heavier and required more skilled labor to create. A good plow could cost several months of a farmer's income, making it unaffordable for many individuals. However, medieval farmers were known for their strong sense of community and cooperation. In many villages, farmers would pool their resources to buy a moldboard plow that everyone could share. This was a common practice across Europe. Farmers could use the plow for their own fields, but they would also help each other out, working together to get the job done. This cooperation wasn't limited to tools, it extended to things like oxen and labor. For example, many farmers didn't own enough oxen to pull a plow on their own, so they would share oxen with their neighbors. This system created strong bonds between the farmers and allowed them to accomplish more than they could on their own. The moldboard plow didn't just improve farming, it helped build stronger communities. By working together and sharing resources, farmers could make the most of their land and grow more food without overburdening themselves. The moldboard plow had a lasting impact on farming in medieval Europe. It allowed farmers to increase their yields and cultivate more land. The ability to break up the tough soil meant that previously unusable land could now be worked. This contributed to the growth of farming communities and supported population growth across northern Europe. The moldboard plow also played a role in the rise of feudalism. As farming became more efficient, landowners could produce more food, leading to an increase in wealth. This, in turn, supported the development of castles, towns, and trade. Farming was the backbone of the medieval economy, and the moldboard plow helped create a foundation for a more prosperous society. Section 4. The open field system. Farming together. Thriving together in the Middle Ages, another key element of successful farming was the open field system. This system wasn't about individual farmers working their own land in isolation. It was a community effort where the land was divided up for everyone to share. It was a system that required cooperation and collective action, and it allowed medieval farmers to maximize the use of their land and resources. Let us explore how the open field system worked and why it was so effective in helping farmers grow more with less labor. The open field system was an agricultural method used in medieval Europe, where farmland was divided into large fields that were shared by multiple families within a village. Instead of having individual farms separated by fences or walls, the land was divided into several open fields, and each family in the village farmed a few scattered strips across these fields. The land wasn't fenced off and was left open for everyone to access. Each family would typically have 1 or 2 strips in each of the fields. One field might be used for growing grains like wheat or barley, while another might be used for legumes like beans or peas, and the third might be left fallow for a year. This division of the land allowed for flexibility in crop rotation and ensured that no family was solely dependent on one type of crop. While it might sound inefficient at first, the open field system worked surprisingly well for medieval communities. One of the biggest benefits was the sharing of resources. Since land was divided into strips and families farmed several strips in different fields, everyone had access to good and bad land alike. No family would end up stuck with all the poor soil or the most difficult land to work on. It was an egalitarian system that distributed both good and bad farming conditions evenly across the village. But it wasn't just the land that was shared. It was also the labor. Since everyone was working on the same schedule, the entire village would come together to plant, plow, and harvest at roughly the same time. This meant that when it came time to plow the fields or harvest crops, the villagers could cooperate. They would all work together, lending a hand to each other as needed. In many villages, communal labor was the norm, and large-scale farming tasks were completed much faster when the entire community worked together. The open field system helped to maximize efficiency in several ways. First, shared labor meant that farmers didn't have to do all the heavy lifting on their own. For instance, plowing was a massive task. With no modern machinery, plowing the fields by hand could take a lot of time and energy. But when the whole village worked together, they could finish the job much faster. They shared tools like plows, and more importantly, oxen, which were necessary for pulling the plows. This pooling of resources allowed farmers to do more with less. When it came to harvest time, the community would once again come together. The harvest was a stressful period because it was all or nothing. If the crops failed, the community could face starvation. But by working together, the people of a village could make sure everyone's crops were gathered quickly and safely, reducing the risk of loss. During harvest, farmers would spend part of the day working on their own strips and part of the day helping others. This teamwork made the harvest much more manageable and ensured that no crop was left behind. In addition to the open fields, there was often common land that all villagers could use for specific purposes. This land wasn't divided up into strips for individual use. Instead, it was used for grazing livestock, gathering firewood, or even planting small-scale crops. The common land was another example of how medieval farming communities worked together. It provided villagers with additional resources to support their farms. The open field system relied heavily on this communal aspect. By sharing land and resources, villages could make the most of their available space and labor. The common land ensured that no one went without, even during tough years when individual harvests might fail. Villages could pool their resources in ways that allowed them to survive, even in difficult times. One key aspect of the open field system that made it so effective was the ability to rotate crops and give the land time to rest. This was made easier by the fact that the land was divided into multiple fields. The open field system allowed farmers to rest 1/3 or 1/2 of their fields at a time, ensuring that soil could recover and replenish itself naturally. This helped prevent over-farming and kept the soil healthy for future crops. When the community worked together on these fields, It also ensured that the rotation system could be maintained consistently. Everyone had to follow the same planting and harvesting schedule, which allowed the fields to rotate properly. This system was much more effective than individual farming, where a farmer might plant the same crop year after year, depleting the soil and leading to poor yields. The open field system wasn't just about sharing labor and resources, it was also about managing risk. With unpredictable weather and the constant threat of crop failure, the open field system helped farmers spread out the risk. If one field had a poor harvest due to bad weather or pests, the other fields might still produce good crops, providing some safety net for the village. Additionally, since families didn't rely on just one type of crop, there was always a chance that something would survive. Even if a drought wiped out the wheat, beans, or peas might still thrive. The rotation of crops combined with the shared land system meant that the village as a whole had a better chance of surviving difficult years. Despite its success for centuries, the open field system eventually declined, especially after the 16th century. As land ownership became more private, people started to enclose fields and fence them off, marking the beginning of the enclosure movement. This shift led to a move away from communal farming, and the land became increasingly divided into individual plots. However, the open field system had been a key part of medieval farming for centuries, and its legacy can still be seen in modern farming communities that emphasize cooperation and collective action. Section 5. Innovative pest control. Using nature's helpers. Medieval. Farmers didn't have the luxury of modern pesticides to protect their crops from pests. Instead, they relied on natural methods and creativity to keep bugs, insects, and other pests at bay. While today's farmers can easily spray chemicals to deal with pests, medieval farmers had to turn to nature itself for solutions. The result was a surprisingly effective and environmentally friendly approach to pest control. Pests have always been a major threat to crops, and in medieval times, they were even more of a concern. Without modern pesticides or chemical treatments, crops were vulnerable to damage from insects, rodents, and even larger animals like birds. Crops like wheat, barley, and vegetables could be wiped out by pests in a matter of days. Insects such as aphids, caterpillars, and weevils would devour plants, while rodents would sneak in and steal stored grains. Without effective methods to protect their crops, farmers in the Middle Ages faced a constant battle. The threat of pests was one of the most significant challenges they had to overcome. However, as we'll see, they developed some clever and natural ways to manage these pests without relying on harmful chemicals. One of the most ingenious methods medieval farmers used for pest control involved chickens. Chickens were not only valued for their eggs and meat, they also played a crucial role in pest management. Farmers would allow their chickens to roam freely in their fields before planting and after harvest. The chickens would peck at insects, larvae, and weed seeds while scratching through the soil, effectively reducing pest populations. A single chicken can consume up to 700 insects per day, so a small flock of chickens could clear thousands of bugs from the field in no time. This natural pest control method was highly effective and required very little effort from the farmers. It was also cost-effective, since chickens could be raised for both their meat and their pest-fighting abilities. Ducks and geese were also used for pest control, with ducks particularly helping in controlling snails and slugs, while geese were excellent at eating weeds without damaging the crops themselves. In addition to using animals for pest control, medieval farmers also practiced companion planting. This technique involved planting certain crops together because they benefited each other. Some plants naturally repel pests, while others can attract beneficial insects that help with pest control. For example, strong-smelling plants like garlic, onions, and leeks were often planted at the edges of gardens and fields. These plants release sulfur compounds that repel many insects, making them a natural barrier against pests. Farmers also planted flowers like marigolds, lavender, and other fragrant blooms around their fields. These flowers attracted beneficial insects like ladybugs, lacewings, and predatory wasps, which hunted down pests like aphids and caterpillars. These beneficial insects acted like a tiny, free army of natural pest controllers. This method was both effective and environmentally friendly, as it reduced the need for chemical pesticides and supported biodiversity in the fields. Interestingly, the method of crop rotation, which we discussed earlier, also played a role in pest control. Pests tend to specialize in eating certain types of crops. For example, a pest that attacks beans might not be interested in wheat. By rotating crops each year, farmers made it more difficult for pests to establish themselves in one place. The rotation system effectively confused pests, preventing them from getting comfortable and building up in one field. Just as changing locations could prevent pests from settling in, crop rotation made the farm less attractive to them. This was another way medieval farmers used nature to their advantage. Instead of relying on harmful chemicals, they worked with the natural behaviors of pests and crops to maintain healthier, more pest-free fields. Medieval farmers also avoided planting large monocultures of the same crop. Instead, they mixed different types of crops together in a single field. This diversity in plantings helped slow the spread of pests that target specific crops. For example, a pest that might love to eat wheat could find its food supply limited if the field was mixed with beans, peas, or other plants that the pest wasn't interested in. By diversifying what they grew, medieval farmers made it harder for pests to focus on a single type of crop. This natural defense mechanism meant fewer pests could build up large populations, reducing the damage they caused. Additionally, the diversity of crops ensured that even if one crop didn't do well due to pests, others might still thrive, spreading out the risk. The fight against pests didn't end once the crops were harvested. In fact, protecting the harvested crops was just as important. Storage pests like weevils, rodents, and moths could destroy entire grain stocks if left unchecked. Medieval farmers were aware of this and had several strategies for keeping their harvested crops safe from pests. One common method was to store grains in buildings with raised floors that prevented rodents from reaching the stored food. The floors allowed air to circulate beneath the grain, keeping it dry and less likely to spoil. Grain was often stored in granaries, special storage buildings designed to keep pests out and preserve the grain for months or even years. In some cases, farmers would mix their stored grain with ashes from their hearths. The fine ash would suffocate pests like weevils and other insects without harming the grain. It was a simple but effective way of keeping storage pests at bay, and it was an environmentally friendly method that didn't require any chemical treatments. Section 6. Weed control. Outwitting the weeds, weeds have always been a constant challenge for farmers. In medieval times, without herbicides or modern weed control tools, farmers had to rely on a combination of creativity, timing, and hard work to keep their fields free from invasive plants that could steal nutrients from their crops. Despite the limited resources available, medieval farmers developed a variety of clever methods to keep weeds under control and ensure healthy, productive crops. Weeds are a problem for farmers everywhere. They grow quickly, take up space, and steal essential nutrients from the soil that crops need to thrive. In medieval times, without the modern tools we have today, the fight against weeds was an ongoing struggle. Weeds like thistles, dandelions, and wild grasses could easily overwhelm a field if left unchecked. This was especially problematic because weeds not only competed for nutrients, but also reduced crop yields by blocking sunlight and crowding out the plants farmers depended on. In addition to competing with crops, weeds also made harvesting more difficult. Tall, unwanted plants could make it harder to gather the good crops, and getting rid of them could take up valuable time and energy. One of the most effective techniques medieval farmers used to combat weeds was high-density planting. This method involved planting crops closely together in the field, which helped to block out sunlight from reaching the ground. Weeds need sunlight to grow, so by crowding crops together, farmers could reduce the amount of space available for weeds to sprout. This approach was particularly useful for crops like wheat, barley, and vegetables. When planted closely together, the crops would form a dense canopy that made it difficult for weeds to establish themselves. This natural method of blocking sunlight was an efficient and simple way to reduce weed growth without relying on harmful chemicals or excessive labor. Timing was another crucial factor in medieval weed control. Farmers knew that the best time to deal with weeds was when they were still young and had just started sprouting. The longer weeds were allowed to grow, the more difficult they became to remove. Medieval farmers would carefully schedule their weeding efforts, aiming to tackle weeds just after planting when the seedlings were still small and easy to remove. Using tools like hand mattocks, farmers would skim just below the surface of the soil, cutting weed seedlings before they could establish strong roots. This process was quick and efficient, allowing farmers to remove weeds before they had a chance to spread. In addition to early weeding, some farmers would schedule multiple weeding sessions throughout the growing season. By staying on top of weeds at different stages of growth, they could keep their fields much cleaner, making it easier to harvest crops later on. One of the most valuable tools in medieval weed management was the weeding hook. This was a small, sharp blade attached to a long handle, which allowed farmers to reach between crop plants and remove weeds without having to bend over. This was especially helpful in fields where crops were planted closely together, as the weeding hook could be used to remove weeds from tight spaces. A skilled farmer using a weeding hook could clear a field of weeds much faster than by hand pulling them. The weeding hook was a time-saving tool that allowed farmers to control weeds efficiently, reducing the amount of physical labor required. In fact, records from medieval wills show that these weeding hooks were often passed down as valuable family heirlooms, indicating how important they were to a farmer's livelihood. After the harvest, medieval farmers would immediately plow the fields to help prevent the spread of weeds. This technique was particularly effective for weeds that had dropped seeds onto the soil during the growing season. By plowing the fields, farmers buried the weed seeds too deep to germinate. This prevented the seeds from sprouting and gave the next crop a better chance to grow. This practice was part of a larger strategy to manage weeds throughout the entire farming cycle. By using plowing as a form of weed control, farmers reduced the risk of future weed problems and kept their fields in good condition for the next planting season. Another clever method medieval farmers used was the stale seedbed technique. This involved preparing a field for planting, but instead of planting seeds right away, the farmer would wait for about 1 to 2 weeks, allowing weeds that had already dropped seeds into the soil to begin sprouting. Once the weeds started to grow, the farmer would use a hoe or weeding tool to remove them before planting the actual crop. This method was highly effective because it allowed farmers to clear the field of weeds before planting crops. It also meant that the crops had a better chance to grow without competition from the weeds. By eliminating the weed problem early in the process, farmers could reduce the amount of weeding needed later on. In vegetable gardens, farmers sometimes used a method of mulching to help control weeds. They would spread materials like straw, leaves, or even wool waste between the rows of crops. This created a natural barrier that blocked sunlight from reaching the soil, making it harder for weeds to germinate. The mulch also helped retain moisture in the soil, which was especially useful during dry periods. Mulching was a simple and effective way to keep weeds under control, while also providing other benefits, like soil protection and improved water retention. It was an easy solution that didn't require much labor, and used natural materials that were readily available. Weeding wasn't always a solo task in medieval farming. It was often done as a community effort. In many villages, the entire community would come together during weeding season to clear fields quickly and efficiently. This collective effort helped reduce the amount of time each farmer spent on weeding, and it ensured that the fields were kept free of unwanted plants. The tradition of communal weeding days was a key part of the medieval farming lifestyle. It strengthened bonds within the village and created a sense of shared responsibility for the land. Villages that worked together were better able to manage their farms, and this cooperation contributed to the success of medieval agriculture. Section 7. Managing weather. Adapting to the unknown weather has always been one of the biggest challenges in farming. Today, modern farmers can rely on weather forecasts, irrigation systems, and even crop insurance to manage weather risks. But for medieval farmers, the unpredictability of weather was a constant source of stress and uncertainty. They had no way of predicting the future, and bad weather, too much rain, not enough, or unexpected frost could destroy an entire harvest. Yet, despite these risks, medieval farmers developed a variety of clever strategies to cope with and manage the weather, ensuring their survival even in the most unpredictable conditions. Weather could make or break a medieval harvest. Too much rain could flood fields, drown crops, and lead to fungal diseases. On the other hand, drought could leave crops withering in the soil, making it impossible to grow enough food to survive. Unpredictable frost could destroy delicate crops just when they were about to mature, while hailstorms could tear through entire fields in a matter of minutes. Since there were no weather predictions or modern irrigation systems, Farmers had to deal with whatever nature threw their way. However, the unpredictability of the weather didn't stop them from finding ways to adapt. Through careful planning, diversified farming, and a bit of luck, medieval farmers could survive even in the face of bad weather. One of the most important strategies medieval farmers used to manage weather was diversification. Rather than relying on a single crop, they would plant several different types of crops each year. For example, they might grow grains like wheat, barley, and rye, as well as legumes like peas and beans, and even vegetables such as cabbage and turnips. The benefit of planting different types of crops was that it spread the risk. Some crops were more tolerant of wet conditions, while others could handle drought better. For instance, rye could thrive in cooler, wetter climates, while beans and peas could handle dry spells much better than wheat or barley. By diversifying their crops, farmers ensured that they had a backup if one crop failed due to weather conditions. Even if a drought ruined the barley crop, the peas might still survive, or if heavy rains damaged the wheat, the beans or turnips might still yield a harvest. Diversification allowed farmers to hedge their bets, ensuring that they had at least something to harvest, even in bad weather years. Another way medieval farmers adapted to unpredictable weather was by planting crops in different locations. They didn't rely on just one field to grow all their crops. Instead, they would spread their plantings across different areas of their land, each with slightly different environmental conditions. For example, a farmer might plant one field of wheat in a low-lying area prone to flooding and another on higher ground that was less likely to get waterlogged. By planting in multiple locations, farmers could avoid a total loss in case one area experienced a weather disaster. If one field flooded or dried out, another field might still thrive. This strategy helped ensure that even if one crop was wiped out, others might still survive, providing food for the community. Timing was another important factor in managing weather. Medieval farmers would stagger their planting over a few weeks to reduce the risk of losing everything to a single weather event. For example, if a late frost hit early plantings, the later planted crops might survive and still produce a good harvest. Staggering the planting of crops also meant that the farmer's labor was spread out, which helped manage the workload. Instead of planting all the crops at once, farmers could focus on one batch of crops at a time, reducing the chances of having too much to do during the peak of the growing season, areas prone to flooding. Medieval farmers developed techniques to manage water and protect their crops from too much moisture. They dug drainage ditches to divert excess water away from their fields, ensuring that crops wouldn't be drowned by heavy rains. These ditches could also be used to control water flow during seasonal floods, preventing fields from being overrun by water. On the flip side, in areas where droughts were common, medieval farmers built raised fields mounds of soil that were elevated above the surrounding land. These raised fields helped prevent crops from becoming waterlogged during wet periods, but they also allowed the soil to retain moisture during dry spells. This technique gave crops a better chance of surviving during times of limited rainfall. In some cases, medieval farmers even built water meadows, a system of controlled flooding that used streams to temporarily flood fields, allowing crops to thrive in otherwise dry areas. This technique, which involved diverting water to flood fields at specific times, helped farmers manage both water scarcity and excess water. Without modern tools like satellites or weather apps, medieval farmers had to rely on nature itself to predict the weather. They developed a keen understanding of the natural signs that indicated upcoming weather changes. Farmers would observe things like cloud patterns, animal behavior, and plant growth to predict what the weather might do next. For example, if cows were lying down in a field, it often meant that rain was coming. If there was a red sky at night, it typically signaled good weather for the following day. Farmers also observed the behavior of insects. If bees were particularly active in the early morning, it was often a sign of fair weather. These natural indicators helped farmers prepare for changes in the weather, even if they couldn't predict it with complete accuracy. Medieval farmers' ability to adapt to the weather was one of the key reasons their agricultural systems were successful for centuries. They didn't have modern technology, but they made up for it with their creativity, knowledge of the land, and resourcefulness. Their strategies for dealing with weather, such as diversifying crops, planting in different locations, and using water management techniques, helped them survive through difficult years and avoid total crop failure. The adaptability and resilience of medieval farming systems laid the foundation for the agricultural practices we still use today. Though modern technology has made it easier to predict and manage weather, the principles of weather adaptation and resource management used by medieval farmers are still relevant to modern farming. Section 8. Harvesting and food preservation in medieval farming. The harvest was not just the culmination of months of hard work, it was also a crucial time for preparing for the months of winter, when fresh food was scarce, with no refrigerators, freezers, or modern canning methods. Farmers had to come up with effective ways to preserve their food for the long, cold months ahead. Harvesting and preserving food were essential skills, and medieval farmers developed several ingenious techniques to ensure that they could store and protect their crops for months or even years. The harvest was the busiest time of year for medieval farmers. It was a critical moment when the success or failure of the entire year's labor could be determined. If the harvest went well, the village would be able to survive the winter and even have enough to trade or share with neighboring communities. If the harvest failed, it could lead to hunger, famine, and even death. Given the importance of the harvest, medieval farmers had to be organized and efficient. This meant working together as a community to get the job done quickly and effectively. It was about ensuring that the food could be preserved to last until the next growing season. Proper storage techniques were just as important as the harvest itself. One of the most effective ways medieval farmers preserved their food was by storing root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and beets in clamps. A clamp was essentially an underground storage pit that helped keep vegetables fresh for months. To create a clamp, farmers would dig a pit about 2 to 3 feet deep, then line the pit with straw for insulation. They would fill the pit with the root vegetables, cover them with more straw, and then pile soil on top to protect them from the cold. Grains like wheat, barley, and rye were also critical staples for medieval farmers. Like root vegetables, grains needed to be kept dry to prevent spoilage and pests. To store their grains, farmers built granaries, small buildings with raised floors. These raised floors allowed air to circulate underneath the grain, keeping it dry and preventing mold from developing. Granaries were often built on pillars with the space underneath protected from rodents that could easily climb wooden walls. The grain was often left on the stalk or stored in its husk, which provided additional protection against pests. This method of storage kept the grain fresh for 2 to 3 years, providing a reliable food source for the village, even in times of crop failure. Grain was essential not only for food, but for making bread, which was a staple in most medieval diets. By storing grain properly, farmers ensured they would have enough food for the long winter months. Meat preservation was another crucial task for medieval farmers. Without refrigeration, fresh meat would spoil quickly, especially during the warmer months. To preserve meat for long-term storage, medieval farmers relied on salting and smoking, 2 methods that were both effective and widely used. The process involved rubbing meat, such as pork, beef, or fish, with salt. The salt drew out moisture from the meat, preventing bacteria from growing and causing spoilage. Once salted, the meat was packed into barrels or clay containers and left to cure for several weeks or even months. This method could preserve meat for extended periods, and salted meat was a key food source during the winter. Smoking was another popular method for preserving meat. Farmers would hang the meat in smokehouses, where a low fire would slowly dry the meat while imparting smoky flavors. The smoke acted as a preservative, adding chemicals that prevented spoilage. Smoked meat could be stored for months, making it a vital source of protein during the winter months. Both salting and smoking were common techniques that helped medieval farmers keep meat edible for months or even years. This was especially important during the colder months when fresh meat was not available. In addition to root vegetables and meat, fermentation was another key method for preserving food in the Middle Ages. Many vegetables, including cabbage, turnips, and carrots, were preserved through fermentation, an ancient method that uses bacteria and yeasts to naturally preserve food. To ferment vegetables, farmers would slice them thinly, pack them tightly in barrels, and then cover them with salt. The salt drew out moisture and allowed beneficial bacteria to grow, which fermented the vegetables. The process also added essential nutrients, including vitamins that were needed during the winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. Fermented vegetables, such as sauerkraut, were often eaten as side dishes, and they provided a good source of nutrition during the long winter. Dairy products were also preserved by turning them into cheese. Excess milk was made into cheese, which could then be coated in wax or cloth and stored in cool cellars. Cheese could be aged for months and was an essential part of the medieval diet. In addition to vegetables and meat, fruit was an important part of the medieval diet. To preserve fruit, farmers often used the method of drying. Fruit, like apples, pears, and berries, could be sliced and dried in the sun or over a fire. Dried fruit could be stored for months and was a good source of vitamins during the winter. Some medieval farmers also practiced early forms of canning. They would pack fruits like apples, berries, and other produce in jars and seal them with fat or wax to keep the air out. These jars could be stored in cool, dark places and preserved for months. Canning was a more rudimentary method than the modern techniques we use today, but it worked well enough to provide food for the winter months. In many medieval villages, community grain stores were established to help ensure everyone had enough food to survive tough years. If a family had a bad harvest, they could borrow grain from the communal store and pay it back in the next season. This system provided a safety net for villagers and helped prevent famine during poor harvest years. Community storage also played a role in preserving food collectively. Shared storage spaces meant that even if one family couldn't preserve enough food on their own, they could rely on the community to help them through difficult times. Section 9. The role of the village. Community farming in medieval times. Farming was not an individual activity, but a collective effort. While it may seem like farming is all about personal land and personal labor, the reality in the Middle Ages was very different. Communities often relied on shared resources, cooperation, and collective labor to survive and thrive. Whether it was working together during the harvest or sharing tools and livestock. The strength of the medieval farming system came from the cooperation of the entire village. The medieval farming system was based on the principle that the whole village shared the responsibility for farming land, growing crops, and ensuring everyone had enough food to eat. Instead of each family working a completely separate farm, the village's land was divided into large, open fields that were farmed by the entire community. The land was shared and cultivated by many people, and each family had several scattered strips of land across these fields. This method wasn't just about the land itself. It was about the collective effort needed to work the land. Working together allowed the community to achieve far more than any one farmer could manage on their own. The idea of sharing resources extended beyond just land, also involved tools, livestock, and labor. The open field system encouraged people to work together, often fostering a sense of shared responsibility for the success or failure of the harvest. Under the open field system, land wasn't individually owned in the way it is today. Instead, it was divided into strips, and each family had several strips scattered across different fields. This ensured that no family got stuck with only good or bad land. Everyone got a mix of fertile land and poorer soil. This fair distribution of land helped maintain social balance and reduced conflict within the community. More importantly, this system made crop rotation and sustainable farming possible. Because the village worked on the same rotation system, it was a coordinated effort to manage the land and preserve its fertility. If one field was left fallow to recover, it was easier to ensure the rest of the village was still growing enough food. The idea of shared labor was central to medieval farming. The success of the harvest depended on everyone in the village coming together to get the job done. When it was time to plant, plow, or harvest, the whole community worked together. If a family lacked enough oxen to plow their fields, the community would help, sharing oxen and plows. In some areas, villages even had a common herd of oxen that everyone could use for farming. During the harvest season, farmers worked alongside their neighbors to ensure the crops were gathered quickly and efficiently. Without modern machinery, harvesting could be a time-consuming and back-breaking task. But with everyone working together, it was faster and more manageable. Even families that were busy with their own fields would take time to help others with theirs, and vice versa. This sense of collective responsibility ensured that every family contributed to the community's success. In times of hardship, such as poor harvests or crop failures, This system of shared labor also helped prevent individual families from going hungry, as they could count on their neighbors to support them. In addition to sharing labor, medieval communities also pooled resources. Owning farming tools was expensive, and not every family could afford the equipment needed to plow, harvest, or thresh crops. Rather than each family owning their own plow or sickle, they would share tools as a community. This pooling of resources wasn't limited to tools, it extended to livestock as well. Oxen were essential for plowing, but not every family could afford to keep their own pair. So villagers would share oxen, often rotating the animals between families or even pooling animals for communal plowing efforts. This sharing system helped reduce costs and increased efficiency. This cooperation in resources also helped the village manage food security. If one family experienced a bad harvest, they could rely on the collective grain store or share what they had grown. This system made the entire village more resilient to crop failures or tough seasons. Medieval villages also had common land, which was shared by all the villagers. The common land was used for grazing livestock, gathering firewood, and even growing small crops. This land wasn't divided into strips for individual use, but was collectively managed. The idea of common land was crucial for the survival of the village, because it allowed everyone to access resources that might otherwise have been out of reach. For example, if a farmer's cattle didn't have enough pasture to graze, the common land was there to provide that space. Similarly, if a family needed firewood, they could gather it from the common land. This shared land provided crucial resources that made the village self-sufficient and ensured that no one went without. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of medieval farming communities was the community grain store. In many villages, there was a shared granary where grain was stored for everyone's use. If a family had a poor harvest, or if a disaster struck, they could rely on the granary to provide enough food to survive. The grain stores were communal, meaning that even in the worst years, and some families might have struggled, the village as a whole could make it through tough times. Villagers could borrow grain from the common store and pay it back in the next harvest. This created a system of shared risk, where the impact of a failed harvest was spread out among the entire village. The grain stores also played a key role in preventing famine. They ensured that everyone would have access to food during difficult times. While working together on the farm was essential, medieval farming communities also held celebrations around the farming calendar, which brought people together and strengthened social bonds. Festivals were held after the harvest to celebrate the success of the crops, and these occasions often involved feasts, dancing, and shared merriment. These community events were not just for fun, they also reinforced the sense of unity and cooperation. When everyone worked together throughout the year, celebrating the success of the harvest gave people the opportunity to reflect on their shared effort and give thanks for the food they had grown together. This communal spirit helped create a strong sense of social cohesion, and it made the village a much more resilient place to live. The cooperation that defined medieval farming went beyond just the land, it shaped the community as a whole. Section 10. The legacy of medieval farming innovations. Medieval farming may seem far removed from the highly mechanized agriculture we know today, but the innovations and methods developed by medieval farmers laid the groundwork for many of the agricultural practices we still use. These medieval farming techniques, born out of necessity, were incredibly effective and helped sustain growing populations across Europe. As time went on, they evolved and eventually contributed to the development of modern farming practices. Let us explore how these medieval innovations shaped the agricultural systems that followed, and how some of their practices continue to influence farming today. One of the most significant agricultural innovations of the medieval period was crop rotation. As we've seen, crop rotation allowed farmers to replenish the soil and grow more food without depleting the land's nutrients. The concept of rotating crops between fields to maintain soil fertility was groundbreaking for its time and remains at the heart of modern, sustainable farming practices. The idea of rotating crops has evolved, with modern systems like no-till farming and cover cropping drawing from medieval techniques. These methods focus on minimizing soil disturbance and maintaining healthy, fertile soil. The basic principle of crop rotation using diverse crops to support soil health has been passed down through generations and remains essential in modern agriculture. The introduction of the moldboard plow was another pivotal innovation in medieval farming. The The moldboard plow transformed agriculture by making it possible to effectively work the tough, clay-heavy soils of northern Europe. This plow allowed farmers to break through dense soil, turn it over, and bury weeds and organic material, enriching the soil for the next planting season. The moldboard plow was eventually improved and modified as technology progressed, leading to the development of modern plows and other farming equipment. Today's tractors and mechanized plows are direct descendants of the medieval moldboard plow, which revolutionized how farmers worked the land. Its impact on soil preparation, farming efficiency, and the ability to cultivate more land is still felt today. The open field system, with its emphasis on communal land use and labor sharing, was an incredibly efficient way to organize farming in medieval villages. It helped maximize the use of available land, reduced risks, and ensured that everyone had access to a portion of both good and bad soil. Moreover, it allowed farmers to pool resources, such as tools, livestock, and labor, to get the work done. While the open field system gradually declined as land ownership became more private and individual farming took hold, its core principles of cooperation and shared resources influenced later farming practices. The idea of cooperative farming continues in some parts of the world today, particularly in communal agricultural systems and cooperatives, where farmers pool resources to maximize efficiency and share risks. Medieval farmers relied heavily on animals for both labor and food. Oxen were used to pull plows, and horses, pigs, and chickens provided essential sources of food. The careful management of livestock was integral to medieval farming, and many of the principles of animal husbandry practiced in the Middle Ages laid the foundation for modern animal farming. Today, animal-powered farming has been mostly replaced by tractors and machinery. However, the basic principles of animal care, feeding, breeding, and maintaining healthy livestock are still central to agriculture. In fact, sustainable farming movements, such as organic farming and regenerative agriculture, often draw from traditional methods of livestock management, where animals play a crucial role in maintaining soil health and biodiversity. Medieval farmers developed numerous methods for preserving food, from salting and smoking meat to fermenting vegetables and storing grains in granaries. These preservation techniques were vital for surviving harsh winters and ensuring that communities had food during lean times. The principles of drying, fermenting, and curing food that were used in the Middle Ages are still widely used today, especially in the production of cheese, sausages, and pickled vegetables. Modern preservation techniques, such as canning, freezing, and refrigeration, evolved from these earlier methods. The idea of storing food for future use, ensuring it remains safe to eat, and retains its nutritional value, is deeply rooted in the medieval practices that helped sustain societies for centuries. Perhaps the most important legacy of medieval farming innovations is the sense of community that underpinned much of the agricultural system. Medieval farmers worked together, shared resources, and cooperated in ways that made survival possible. From the open field system to shared labor and communal food stores, the village was the backbone of medieval agriculture. While modern farming is often seen as an individual pursuit, the idea of collective effort in farming is still alive today. Where local farmers and consumers work together to grow and share food is a modern example of this spirit of cooperation. Moreover, principles of working together to manage risk and share resources are central to sustainable farming practices, which are designed to foster resilience in the face of challenges like climate change. Medieval farmers had no choice but to be resourceful. They used what they had, worked with the land, and found ways to sustain their crops and livestock. Their innovations were based on a deep understanding of the natural world and how to live in harmony with it. In many ways, the practices medieval farmers developed are still relevant today, especially as the world faces challenges like soil depletion, water scarcity, and climate change. Modern farming is moving toward more sustainable and resilient practices, inspired by the lessons learned from medieval agriculture. Techniques like crop rotation, organic farming, and community cooperation are all part of a growing movement that seeks to rebuild a more sustainable food system. The medieval farmers' emphasis on efficiency, sustainability, and adaptability provides valuable insights for today's agricultural systems. While modern technology has transformed farming, The innovations developed during the Middle Ages laid the groundwork for many of the farming techniques we use today, from the moldboard plow to the principles of crop rotation and the importance of communal labor. These medieval innovations shaped the agricultural systems that followed and continue to influence farming practices across the world. Section 11. Conclusion. The power of smarter farming. As we look back on the history of medieval farming, it's clear that these early farmers were pioneers of innovation. They didn't have the tools we take for granted today, yet they found ways to feed entire villages, to build communities, and to make the most of the land they worked. Their methods, though simple, were incredibly effective, and their legacy continues to influence modern farming practices. Medieval farmers taught us that with creativity, teamwork, and respect for the land, it's possible to do more with less. They understood the importance of working together, of sharing resources, and of making the best use of what nature provided. These lessons are as relevant today as they were centuries ago, especially as we face challenges like climate change and food security. The ingenuity of medieval farmers lives on in the sustainable farming practices that are shaping the future. Their legacy reminds us that farming is more than just a job, it's a way of life, a commitment to the land, and a shared responsibility to ensure that future generations can thrive. So, next time you sit down for a meal, remember the farmers of the past who worked tirelessly to put food on the table. Their resourcefulness and determination laid the foundation for the food systems we rely on today. And as we move forward, let's honor their legacy by embracing smarter, more sustainable ways to farm and by remembering that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful.